I don't think I've ever witnessed a video of a gay quote-unquote nikah, but it's sort of a strange thing in theory, right? Because the nikah itself, you need 2 witnesses, you need mahar. Like who gave who the mahar? Like all of these open-ended questions still present themselves, and who's the wali, right? Does one of them need a wali?
Do they need a wali?
Right. No. In some ways, it
They're
actually.
both walis. But fundamentally, when I ask young Muslims, why are you Muslim? The top answer seems to be because my parents are Muslim. Yeah. And that leaves young Muslims very weak because they can't connect why we're asked to do something or not do something or believe in something to a very firm conviction or foundation. Why are we believing this? Everybody else believes in this. Why don't we believe in it? Why can't we accept that people should better live how they want? So they're bought into the propaganda because they fundamentally carry such a weak foundation.
Chapter 2 is women's rights, and chapter 3 is the gay international, right? So this is a global kind of agenda, not necessarily to spread fahisha. That's probably, some people have that intention anyway, but on a policy level and on a kind of discursive level, it's to reproduce the othering of Muslims as and the twin kind of colonial impulses of to dominate and to civilize. Assalamu alaikum everyone, welcome to this special episode of the Unscripted podcast. We have Yusuf Patel as our co-host today from SRE Islamic and a regular contributor at Islam Transcend. Jazakallah khair for coming, Yusuf. And we're here because we have Ustadh Mobeen Vaid here from the United States. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
And Ustadh Mobeen, mashallah, is a public intellectual. He does lectures and talks and stuff about, and has written a lot over the last many years about things including, LGBT, sex education, liberalism and so forth in the American context, in the American Muslim community. So basically he's like an American Yusuf Patel.
No, but the difference is,
the
difference is I spoke to a brother once who said, I read his article, it was really good. After I consulted a thesaurus, I really agreed with it. Alhamdulillah, he's much.
I didn't know you like dinosaurs.
Okay.
But mashallah. So we were just before we started rolling, we were talking about a few things like this gay, quote unquote, gay nikah video that was going around. Yusuf was showing us. Have you come across stuff like that?
That specific video, no. I don't think I've ever witnessed a video of a gay quote unquote nikah, but it's sort of a strange thing in theory, right? Because the nikah itself, you need 2 witnesses, you need mahar. Like who gave who the mahar? Like all of these open-ended questions still present themselves, and who's the wali, right? Does one of them need a wali?
Do they need a wali?
Right.
No.
In some ways, it
They're both
actually
walis.
the entire structure of the Muslim marriage, in some ways, bespeaks the fact that it's an inherently heterosexual institution, and trying to reform it into something that can accommodate gay people is really just putting Surah Al-Fatiha recitation on top of what looks like some sort of Christian ceremony, but with shalwar kurta or something, or shalwar kameez, right?
They went too far when they desecrated the shalwar kameez.
Absolutely. My sentiments exactly.
Yeah, that's enough is enough.
That
We need to do
was the
something.
red line.
We need to do something, man.
That was the red line.
Yeah. So you mentioned something about Ireland?
Yeah, I think I want to talk to you about Ireland because
Sure.
there's this viral video going around. This non-Muslim lady, she's in the library. She sees lots of books on a display.
Okay.
One of those is This Book is Gay, which has actually caused controversy in Detroit, wasn't it? In Michigan. Okay. And so she opens up the book and says, look, this book is in the library. This is disgusting. It includes a section called How to Argue with Muslims, which seeks to justify same-sex relationships, and it says the Quran has no problem with these types of relationships.
Have you got a copy of it?
I ordered it from Amazon, and just before I came, it said delivered, so I couldn't bring it with me. Sorry. But I wanted
maybe
to...
we'll add some B-roll on top of it, on top of the
But it's
video.
interesting. I wanted to get your view on that because it intersects with what happened in Detroit, Michigan. I think it was last year, was it, or earlier this year? Probably last year.
On Dearborn, they had some protests, I remember, at the school board level with parents speaking out. You've also had situations recently, relatively recently, in some Canadian schools where the schools have invited Muslim speakers who are pro-LGBT to speak in assemblies to the students, and these assemblies were specifically geared towards the Muslim students to let them know that there's no reason for them to be religiously concerned about pro-LGBT material. So a lot of these schools are realizing that they need to get ahead of Muslim controversies, try to stifle them before they emerge or manifest. And so they're doing more and more to endorse this type of material or promote it within the school level. We're seeing that in other school boards too, where they're looking for Muslims to side with the pro-LGBT side when these issues break out. So when they have open school board hearings and people are going to speak, they look for Muslims who can represent the pro-LGBT side to get on the microphone and say, my name is whatever, I'm a Muslim and I'm in favor of homosexual and transgender teachings for children. This is about inclusion, it's about accommodation, it's about giving every human being his or her dignity, et cetera, et cetera. All right, that's the message that they're looking to get out and promote. That's been going on for some time. It's just now accelerated a little bit because of these controversies. In fact, there are some organizations that have sprouted up over the last, probably in the last 5 to 10 years, in the US at least, I don't know the scene in the UK as well, that were funded by non-Muslim liberal think tanks and other organizations. There's one that's called Advocates for Youth. That's a good example, Advocates for Youth. And they have a specific chapter that is dedicated towards Muslims. And they are very explicit about looking for Muslims who are pro-LGBT as a moral matter. They're looking for queer Muslims. They're looking for trans Muslims. They want them to be part of that institution. They want them to become new voices within the Muslim community, and that organization promotes them. They have different activities and efforts that they put behind. Thankfully, a lot of these organizations haven't really grown as much, but they're starting to get a little bit of support, because as these issues grow and given the way that everything is so politically polarized, and the fact is many Muslims have had their sensibilities re-engineered on issues like this. And so we're going to see more and more that find themselves sympathetic to organizations like that.
One of the things I find that you both have in common, I've been, obviously I know you've known you for a while.
My middle name is Muhammad.
Really?
Yeah, that's what we got in common.
No, my middle name is Zubair.
Oh, sorry. I stabbed in the dark. It was like to be correct. Yeah. Sorry.
So, one thing you do actually have in common is you've both been talking about and writing about and informing, instructing the Muslim community about this kind of stuff since before it became cool and kind of trendy to talk about sex education in your case, and things we can't mention on camera, but LGBT and all that kind of stuff. Is it actually getting worse or increasing, or is it just that it's always been there, but we're getting more and more information about it now, exposed and stuff?
Again, I think perhaps the cultural and political dynamics in the UK are a bit different than the US. In the US, really it's been the last decade that we've seen a huge increase in acceleration in it all. I'd say probably starting around 2012, 2013, we saw a big public promotion for gay marriage. There was a huge cultural push for it. 2015, we saw Obergefell, which was the Supreme Court decision. After that, it was just
what was that in regards to?
So that was same-sex marriage. That was the legalization of same-sex marriage as a, nationwide institution. And so it rendered unlawful any state referendums that defined marriage as between a man and a woman. And it guaranteed civic accommodations, government acknowledgement.
So do you think though that was like the floodgates?
Well, it was definitely a catalyst for a public celebration of homosexuality. Obergefell, in some ways by that point, was almost moot because the culture had become so supportive of homosexuality. You had such, homosexual representation in the media, the pride rallies, everything else had grown so much that it was almost a formality when the Supreme Court passed the decision. But it was the way that it was publicly celebrated that I think really was significant, right? I mean, it just, in many ways, indicated just how far we had gone on the issue, because even if you look back at the Supreme Court's own ruling on it, if you read what the justices, the court opinion says, if you look at President Obama's statements, you look at the statement of different Congress people, including Muslim congressmen. I remember Keith Ellison at that time. All of them were talking about how this was such a milestone that
and Keith
indicated...
Ellison's Muslim, yeah?
Yeah. And it was a milestone. It represented human progress, right? It wasn't just, okay, now we're extending certain civic accommodations to people who are, in a homosexual relationship. What we're now doing is we are like putting a stake in the sand when it comes to human history. Like, that's what we're a part of. We're a part of this really grand moment. And when you're saying something like that, it's transcendental, right? You're now arguing something that has much more metaphysical weight than someone who just says, okay, we just want to extend certain legal accommodations.
And the interesting thing is that you would think that gay marriage would have been legalized in the US before the UK, but actually in the UK it was legalized in 2013. And that was quite a watershed moment as well. And I think the impact it had, because at the time we were saying that it would have an impact on schools, and it did, because schools already had a pre-existing legal obligation in the UK to teach children about the nature of marriage. So when it was legalized, the nature of that discussion changed. So now they had to include the fact that a man can marry a man and a woman can marry a woman. So now if a parent says, no, I don't want you to teach this to my child, say, no, this is the law. We have to teach this to children. We have to talk about the fact that a man can marry a man and a woman can marry a woman. And so it's really interesting that you would have predicted, if given the different political and social situations within both countries, for that to have started in America, but actually in UK preceded the legalization in America.
America is a much more religious country, right?
It historically has been, although now rates of agnosticism are really on the rise in America. I think recent polls are saying between 20 and 30% of the United States now is what they call religiously unaffiliated. And so historically,
how many percent, sorry?
20 to 30%.
20 to 30%.
Which is quite high. I mean, that's a historic high for America. Right? They've never had numbers that high.
Here it's over 70%.
Really?
It's much higher in the UK.
No way.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity, I think, is definitely a minority now.
It's gone beyond the 50% mark, So, I mean, I think the important thing from our perspective is, I mean, especially Islam 21C, our kind of angle is of looking at things is we want to see every Muslim confident, right, impacting the world, and we're looking at their confidence in their Islam and their Muslim skin, right? So there is a generation of people, or some people even today, when they look at something like this, like a man marrying another man or whatever in a legal sense, they feel that this is something they do. This is not something. This is something non-Muslims do, right? Just like they would when we were growing up. There's a bunch of things that we don't do. We understand. Okay, these things are legal, but we don't do that, and we don't even have that desire in our hearts to affirm that thing or anything. I think the big problem is when we start to lose that, right? And kids start to say, why is it? What's wrong with that? Or why is this, it starts to...
And that's why I think there are different ways of looking at this topic overall. I think there are some people that look at it and say, it's just another political football. You have abortion, you have immigration, you have tax policy, and you have LGBT. And these are all just independent political topics that the right and the left are going to argue and debate. And it's just a culture war item. And we should kind of keep a measured stance on it. And I don't think that's entirely unreasonable.
I mean, it kind of is here because the left and the right agree on it.
But in the United States,
there are some differences. There are some differences. There are some minority, like evangelicals, Christians, who don't agree with it. But I think one question I wanted to ask you about is, because you've written very extensively about this, is in the past, there's been either Muslims have been beholden to the left or the right. on a whole host of topics, and they've almost like we ally with the left, we ally with the right, and actually sometimes that's been very unhealthy. So as people have questioned now, because when we were allied to the left, there was no real questioning about that. Yeah, because the left supports on Palestine, maybe supports us on anti-war sentiments during the Iraq war in Afghanistan, and things like that. But now, because there's a growing trend for Muslim values on these issues, these social issues, to align with the right, the question is, why are you the left now? Why are you aligning with the right? The right hate you, and so there's a big push back against that. So I'd be really interested to hear your perspective on this alignment with the left and right, and the fact that sometimes Muslims, they don't necessarily have they don't have an idea of how to engage with either upon our own terms. It's almost as if we have to ally with the left or the right on a whole host of topics.
Use their language, use their imagery, use their ethics and morality.
So that's interesting.
I think I interrupted you when you were saying something before you.
I was just going to say that the thing that makes this issue unique in many ways is that it's the way that it's promoted. There's almost a missionary spirit.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it really. Like, there are very few issues that are getting pushed the way this issue is in the media, in schools, in books, in libraries, just everywhere you turn. It's really unavoidable. Yesterday, the day before, I was shopping downtown here in London, and I was walking through, I guess, the Soho area, and that entire road is just rainbow.
Yes.
The entire road. You can't, I mean, it's draped with the flag everywhere you go.
That's progress. It used to be just red lights.
But Soho has historically been emblematic of the LGBT community, so to speak.
Well, even the administrative vehicles and the municipal vehicles are all rainbow color.
Yes,
and we support. And so, and then you walk around London, you can see cafes and coffee shops with rainbow flags in the windows. And so
even the mayor.
Yeah. I mean, you don't see a lot of issues like this. I mean, you really don't. And so when you start getting into the question of alliances, I mean, it's interesting, at least in America, because we haven't really seen, at least as far as I know, any formal alliance that has occurred between Muslims and the right on anything yet.
Or even the left?
Well, with the left, there's been a lot of alliance work over the years, a ton. Yeah.
The thing that annoys me about the word alliance is it could mean anything, right? Yeah, because I don't know of any actual official alliance because the Muslims aren't as organized as
I mean, one could say that there have been Muslim organizations that have worked with left-wing groups, and public Muslim actors that have stood with and marched alongside, done a lot of things with liberal actors. When it comes to the right, even now, I really haven't seen it. We've seen school board meetings that Muslims have shown up to, and that other non-Muslims who are representing right-wing organizations have shown up to. But those haven't been coordinated. They're just both there objecting to the same thing. And so when people say, Muslims are working with the right, well, are they not supposed to go to the school board meeting? What are they supposed to do? What makes that, Muslims partnering with the right? I can tell you where I live in Maryland, the primary group that has been protesting school teachings alongside Muslims have been Ethiopian Orthodox Christians. And so the Ethiopian church has been coming out with Muslims. They're not a right-wing group, as far as I know. I mean, I don't know what their politics are officially, but they don't strike me as a group that's far right-wing. And Muslims and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, those are the two biggest groups at these hearings.
It's part of the kind of Western, almost let's call it what it is, white hubris, right? To try and to force the ethnics to, into boxes that they've created themselves. So if an African group or whatever, is speaking out against same-sex marriage or whatever, then they're forced to adopt a label, a perspective that isn't even theirs. It's from the French Revolution, right, left wing, right wing, but it's part of the kind of white Western way of defining people and giving them here's the allowable language that you can express yourselves in. You can express yourself, or you'll be understood as, coming from a right wing vantage point. These are the permissible kind of languages or frameworks you can express your disagreement within.
Yeah, especially over the last couple of weeks, it's been interesting how many people. Look, in Montgomery County, one of the women who's on the school board, she said that, it's really challenging what's going on because Muslims sound like white supremacists. She said that directly.
Yeah.
And I thought, what an offensive way to describe us.
I think one of the sorry to cut you off. One of the things I think we need to take a look at how we talk about these things as well, because I'm always kind of, I don't speak to Yusuf a lot about this, that especially du'at and maybe traditionally trained du'at and scholars and so forth, when they talk about these things, they end up reproducing some metaphors, some imagery, some language, some beliefs, even some metaphysics that they don't intend, but they just come with saying words like homosexuality, heterosexuality, for example, in this particular context. So I mean, I remember we did like a youth Q&A once, and a sister just asked. So we asked the parents to kind of leave the room so the teenager they could ask whatever they want. So the one sister said, what's wrong with being gay or lesbian, right? And the reaction that the normal reaction from the other brother was like, just the usual thing, it's not natural, Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, and all that kind of stuff. But I could tell that wasn't gonna wash, because she's expecting that already, because she's expecting that Muslims are going to be just like Christians. And this is where I kind of disagree with the way a lot of us have kind of adopted maybe a right-wing, left-wing and right-wing approaches to this subject, because one term Yusuf and I kind of bandy about, I don't know who invented, I think he coined it, is gaytheism, right? The Muslims are actually gaytheist, okay? Because if we use the word, so if we come across like homosexuality is haram, heterosexuality is wajib, right? If we use this, I think you know where I'm coming from. I think I've read.
Yeah. So I mean, the language is really important. I think if I was going to critique the language, I would just say that it's not sufficiently informed on what the language is conveying.
Yeah.
Right. Especially what the person who's asking the question is going to take away from the language, because even more sophisticated right-wing actors don't speak like that. Yeah. Right. I mean, heck, even atheist right-wingers like a Douglas Murray or something like that wouldn't speak in such an essentialized way. Murray?
Douglas Murray is a Christian, isn't he?
No, I don't think he's Christian, but he identifies as gay, isn't it?
I thought he was an atheist. I could be wrong.
He's an atheist,
yeah, I think he's an atheist. Yeah,
he believes in Judeo-Christian values in general.
Yeah, I think he's... Yeah.
He doesn't subscribe.
Maybe he's a Christian murtad.
Quite possibly. I mean, I don't know his history. A lot of those guys who do leave, they still have some affinity for the culture.
Yes.
Right. They see a cultural inheritance in their parents' generation or something that they want to revive. But nevertheless, when it comes to questions like that, in some ways, it would be nice if we could just rely on very easy sort of appeals to, generic platitudes and everybody's good and we go home, right? Maybe that was enough 15, 20 years ago. It oftentimes isn't enough today, right? Because an answer like that, who knows? A young sister may interpret that and say, okay, well, what are they supposed to do, right? Is that person just like haram? And that's where we have to dissect it, because we say, well, that's not who the person is. That's not sort of our category. That's not how we conceive of human beings.
Exactly.
Right? What you're asking, sort of framed differently, is what should we do? What should a person who, of no choice of their own, experiences predominantly or exclusively homosexual attractions? They experience those. How do we regard such person? And then I think we can have a more productive conversation to say, well, those attractions, just like a lot of sexual attractions people experience, if acted upon, are haram, right? And so when we have just fleeting thoughts, right, we're not accountable for the fleeting thoughts. What we're duty bound to do is to resist those thoughts. That's an ongoing mujahadah. Like we can break things down in different ways, but if it's just left at an undifferentiated level where we're just talking about the gay identity, now sometimes what we've done is we've put ourselves in the corner and we've reproduced language and concepts that's actually on their turf, right? We're actually on their turf now because we are looking at a civic community, right, quote unquote, and we're now talking about people and their humanity and all the rest, and we're putting ourselves in a position to reject the fullness of all of that in a way that, kind of loses a lot of where our moral convictions stand in relation to this entire discussion. And it also inhibits our ability to speak to why this entire issue is a problem for us. Because someone can look at this and say, well, you're just bigoted and hateful because all you have are just these really reflexive, angry rejections, as opposed to something that can engage with this topic and provide me an understanding of why you have an issue with it.
So that's a more nuanced way of looking at things. But what I discussed with Yusuf and many other kind of du'at and mashayikh as well, is for us to go a little bit further and say, so you'll notice maybe Yusuf, when he said, he was talking, he said someone so-and-so identifies as gay, rather than saying so-and-so is gay, right? So that's one of the things that we've been thinking about of maybe offering some advice or guidance to the community of some do's and don'ts, right? Because when someone says homosexual, heterosexual, whatever, from a Muslim perspective, we know what that person means. We know that, you know, when a sheikh says homosexuality or homosexual, they're talking about certain, you know, behaviors and actions, so which is haram. They're talking about liwat, talking about sodomy and so forth. But as you know, that's not what your kids are being taught in school to define as homosexual or heterosexual. It's something beyond that, right? It's a species, and in that light, it's the belief, and this is what I try to kind of hone in on as the actual differentiator between Muslims and everyone else in the from the Western context, it's the actual belief in the existence of a mystical quality inside you, inside every person, called sexuality, and that sexuality is a somatic fact about the body, just like hair color, eye color, height, you know, whatever. And if you deny someone or discriminate against someone based on that, it's just like being a racist, white supremacist, and hence and this is, I think, what we need to kind of get across. Maybe it's not for everyone to dismantle all of that thing theoretically, but at least don't fuel it, right? When talking to our kids, because if you believe that, or if you give the impression that we believe that, yep, there's something called homosexual, yep, there's something called heterosexual, yep, there's something called homosexuality, there's gayness, there's straightness, and we don't critique that, then you're fighting with one hand behind your back, because that discourse only allows two characters. Number one, the enlightened ally, who's helping someone become and express their true, you know, personhood and stuff, because obviously that's a key thing about them, according to that, you know, that metaphysics. Or number two, you're the bigoted, right-wing, religious kind of zealot, homophobe, white supremacist, that kind of person. And it kind of makes sense where they're coming from if we don't critique that issue, if we don't say clearly, you know, this is an issue of us disagreeing with your beliefs of what makes a human, of what is key to personhood, of the existence of gayness and straightness in this binary and so forth. Hence, that's what we mean by gaytheist, right? What do you think about kind of having a kind of framework where we push on our community, don't fall into these narratives, don't be forced to express a belief you don't believe in, right? By, you know.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a website that the Catholic Women's Forum put together called Person and Identity. And that website, it's focused more so on transgenderism, but they have a ton of material that they've produced for the Catholic community that tries to distinguish between a lot of these nuances. What is the Christian view? What is the biblical view of the human person? What is the modern secular view of the human person? They have charts and breakdowns and short videos and things like that. So they have a ton of resources. They even have a network of therapists that are affiliated with them that people can go to if they need help. For Muslims, part of our challenge is that we don't have a lot of resources. Our resources are growing. But when you talk about, you know, our ability to shore up our discourse, we're very much behind. We don't have a lot of material. We're not going to be at that level of sophistication with the young child, right? With the young child, we may simply talk about the family and the Muslim family and just what family looks like. Silat al-Rahim, Birrul Walidain. We'll talk about maintaining the ties of kinship, being good to your parents. We'll reinforce some of those values along the way, but it's going to be more simple. And as they grow, it's going to grow with them in age-appropriate ways. There is a course that the Sapiens Institute is going to be releasing, inshallah, you know, probably within the next month, which is free online. And that's Dr. Carl Sharif Al-Tubji. And that's a 30-hour course on this topic. And it goes through a lot of material, including worldviews, like what is the Islamic worldview? How do you juxtapose or contrast that to the modern secular liberal worldview? So it actually goes through a lot of this material. So you're right, like the discourse has to be shorn up. Part of the challenge is that we're not just dealing with this issue at the level of the aql. Like we just need to get people to sharpen their dialogue. We're also dealing with this at the level of just, culture and society. And that's in some ways the much tougher part of this, because we can have a watertight narrative. We can provide a rationally compelling reason for Islam's morality and for why the Sharia is superior to what these people are trying to provide and promote. And yet, you're just surrounded by people who are pro-LGBT. The amount of media that keeps growing promoting this, corporations, politicians, it's inveterate to some degree. And so you're asking yourself, how do I create a context more collectively that can not only sort of shield our community to some degree from this, but also help them navigate this in a way that's a bit more, forthright and also comprehensive. Right? So,
and do you think that, because sometimes young Muslims, for example, when I hear from, we have maktabs and madrasas here, after school classes for children, and I often hear from these teachers who say, look, the children in my class, more than ever before, are starting to question things that we believe that we all took for granted. So they would say, how can you be homophobic if the maktab teacher, if the madrasa teacher says, we don't believe in these types of values, we don't agree with that, they will say, how can you be homophobic? These people have the right to live their lives how they want to be. They have the right to love each other. And why are we imposing our values on them? And sometimes I really think that it's not just about shoring up those young people's ideas about what is our view on these types of relations, but also fundamentally, what is the link between their understanding about this and just very simple ideas about who should define what is good and bad. What is halal and haram from our perspective? What are the roles of desires and behaviors within within the Quranic narrative? But fundamentally, when I ask young Muslims, why are you Muslim? The top answer seems to be because my parents are Muslim. And that leaves young Muslims very weak, because they can't connect why we're asked to do something or not do something or believe in something to a very firm conviction or foundation. Why we believe in this? Everybody else believes in this. Why don't we believe in it? Why can't we accept that people should better live how they want? So they've bought into the propaganda because they fundamentally carry such a weak foundation because of the way we sometimes help them to reach, in essence, a conclusion about the truth of our purpose and meaning for life.
Yeah, I think with maktabs and even madaris, some of these specialty places or dedicated locations where children and even adults are learning the Islamic tradition, obviously there's a lot of value in them, because there's just a barakah in learning, and Allah knows how much people get shielded from just from being around the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and with other Muslims. Allah knows. Because we're not just sort of a mind, we have a soul, and we're nurturing that in those spaces. Having said that, one of the things that I think most people go through traditional studies do is that you can go into a lot of the traditional literature and find a ton of resources that can help you navigate shubuhat or even deviant groups that existed in the past, right? So if a good student of theology that goes through a madrasa system will know some of the problems with the Mu'tazila, for instance, or the Qaramita, or different groups that just existed, the Khawarij, right? Depending, some of those groups you'll learn about at a deeper level, others may be more cursory, but nevertheless you'll understand their problems, why there were issues, and how we can address them. What you don't get with an education like that is, what is liberalism? What is secularism? How do we address topics like this? Like, how do we understand Western modernity, right? how do we
important, yeah.
like what do we do with?
I would say that's even more important than teaching them about some sect that existed 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, if they were revived and that's all we had to do, we have a ton we can draw on. But we either have to repurpose that material in a way that's pertinent to the specific issues that we're facing, or we have to draw on new material. Even things like, I was reading a recent book by Joseph Minnick on bulwarks of modernity, and that's an entire treatment of the way digital technology has shaped our thinking in modern circumstances and has produced and fomented atheism and unbelief, right? And so you have a lot of literature out there we haven't engaged with in a really serious way, nor have we produced a lot in those spaces. And so people who go through a program of traditional studies, Allah reward them. They're people who are, Prophet ﷺ said, the ulama warathatul anbiya, that they're the inheritors of the prophets. The scholars are the inheritors, and so they're people that we respect, we honor, we learn from them and we study with them, but we do have a challenge at times where we don't have enough people who are both traditionally informed and also literate about contemporary society and what undergirds it. And sort of getting people up to speed on both of those is not an easy task. One, because the people seem to be doing it almost eclectically, right? Like they're just kind of learning in their free time. Maybe they read an article that they like and they'll take that argument. There isn't a structured, sort of systematic way that people are studying this. And then it's also an issue because there are a lot of people who aren't even studying this. Yeah. And so they'll reproduce their language, their concepts, and it's not just in LGBT, in everything, right? If you didn't know better, you would think Islam is a great religion because it is more liberal than other religions, right? Islam is, it's more committed to freedom and independence and autonomy and liberation and all of these categories that are pregnant with conceptual assumptions. Like it's just loaded in coded language, left and right. And you say, wow, like how did this person who's traditionally studied, how can he be talking like this? But you can't really blame people because to some degree, they're using terms that they view as innocuous, and they don't recognize that those terms and categories are not innocuous at all.
And what's worse is Muslims that are fully, not knowing this, but fully subscribe to modern trends and so forth, they will end up attacking the scholar, Muslim scholar, because they identify something which is the other camp, that if they're right wing, then they'll attack him for what appears left wing, and vice versa. But from that vantage point of left, right, or what they've kind of imposed upon the Islam, or even as a reaction to, I think Jonathan Brown once he said there's this continuum, this sellout versus keeping it real continuum, right? So people kind of perform being a tough, kind of uncompromising, shadid, anti, whatever, batil. But in doing so, they've run into the arms of those that are running away from. So which part of the continuum are you on then? I'm not real. What I'm saying is this is we need to get rid of these.
Well, it's very difficult to escape sort of the right-left box. Right? They say that the Overton window it's always in flux, but in general, it defines the boundaries of what acceptable opinion is.
Yes.
And a lot of Muslims will say things like Islam is not left or right, and obviously we'll say, fair enough. But that also means that what Islam says, it doesn't mean that what Islam says is always going to be in the center. It could be to the right of the right. It could be to the left of the left. Yes. It could be off the entire political spectrum on a whole host of issues. It's not predictable or being conditioned by your contemporary political moment. And people have to gain comfort with that because you're not filtering your religion on the basis of what's going to be acceptable to people's political sensibilities, right? In some ways, they are going to have to challenge those sensibilities, especially when the religion is clear on certain issues.
So it's those issues, right? Because what those issues are, which is has to be kind of unpacked a bit as well, because because as a result of us not being clear, as a result of us not being clear, many people just have taken the stereotypes about what Christians say about gays and lesbians and so forth, and assume that that's our position and start arguing and so forth. So let's take for example, in the workplace, this is one of the things that is kind of we're asked about a lot, right? 5 years ago, our brothers would say that, in a corporate setting, their biggest problem was, what do I do when everyone goes to the bar or the pub after work? And, is it okay if I just go and have an orange juice and stuff? Or they feel pressured, right? They said now, alhamdulillah, it's much more inclusive of Muslims, and that, they have on a corporate level that, don't have alcohol at events if you have Muslim staff, or don't, or basically take that into consideration, don't pressurize them into, that. But on the flip side, the things that they're complaining about now is, and this is actually very problematic, because we've found brothers who, and sisters maybe, but I've spoken to brothers who actually don't go and apply for senior leadership positions in companies, in civil service, in whatever corporate setting, because of this now, this LGBT pride is all kind of mixed up, and that, and they think they either have to subscribe to it fully, or they just, what do they do? How do they need a language? They need a language to navigate it. They need a language to show their resistance from a Muslim perspective, without kind of being unfaithful to what Islam actually says, and that's the kind of next, I guess, roadblock for them. And it's very important, because they're actually stopping. We're having, there's like a glass ceiling for them, right?
In some ways, one, I think that sometimes people are going to have to make sacrifices in the name of their religion, right? There's no, Allah didn't promise us that we can do whatever job we want, irrespective of what that job entails. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provides. Inshallah, there's more barakah in the rizq that they take home from the lower position than perhaps the higher one that they could have pursued, but they refrained from taking due to their consideration for their faith. May Allah reward them for that. I think as a community, ideally, in a situation like this, it wouldn't just be left up to individual actors to have to fight this, one situation to another, where they're walking into a workplace and saying, look, I want this position, but here's why it's a problem for me. Ideally, we would have Muslim institutions and organizations that could represent what Islam has to say and do something that could then come to perhaps change corporate culture at an aggregate level, right? So whether it's engaging with different business communities, or even politically doing advocacy work. I look at something like the Navigating Differences statement that was recently released in North America. Those types of things help people in those positions where if there's a Pride Week event and now I'm an individual at my workplace and I don't want to attend, I don't simply have to send an email saying, look, I'm uncomfortable with this, but I can say, this is what my religion says. By the way, here's a statement that hundreds of scholars have signed. And
Yusuf has an idea in that regard.
Okay.
What's that idea?
You're talking about, okay, I can reproduce it here and just claim it as my own. But have a kind of an index of companies, right? A kind of scoring system, where how Muslim friendly is it, right? Because Muslims represent a bigger and bigger slice of the workforce, and we want our brothers and sisters not to disagree with you, but to kind of maybe as a caveat, we don't want Muslims to not go for influential positions. I think we want to have Muslims who are grounded in their Islamic identity, who are quote-unquote good Muslims, but from our perspective, to go for influential positions. And if it does conflict with something in their deen, they should be able to, or we should help as a community to get rid of that roadblock for them. And I think you agree with that anyway, right? That and one of the things is like they need a language like the Navigating Difference document, which is a good segue to talk about that.
Well, even before that, I mean, I know that one of the things that Muslim organizations have done in the past is that they've produced trainings like that. So you have a Muslim organization that says, hey, we do sensitivity trainings, cultural sensitivity trainings for Muslims, and we offer these to public schools where, the administration and staff get to learn about Muslims, and this becomes a piece of everything in the month of Ramadan. Here's what's going on. Here's what you may see Muslims requesting off for Eid. And this is just another piece of the puzzle. Hey, Friday prayers, this, that. And then, for Pride Week, this is impermissible. You can include that as part of your overall training.
What is impermissible though?
What? For Pride Week?
Someone might be like, okay, why isn't Bushra, putting a little flag symbol on her scarf.
I can't imagine what would be permissible for Pride Week or Pride Month or Pride. I mean, what would someone feel religiously comfortable doing, right? I mean, in front of Allah.
That's the thing, right? We need to give them a clear, I guess, because we're not saying, you know, you have to obviously like harm someone or discriminate against them in a particular way, or not be nice to someone who identifies as gay or lesbian. The thing is, for me, right, I find it much more problematic when a Muslim is obviously a disengagement from Pride Week is Pride Month is good for Muslims to disengage, but if they're disengaging for the wrong reason, I think that could be more harmful than just engaging in some kind of whatever at work, but having that understanding that this is my red line, this is why I disagree with this, right? Because it goes back to that thing. If our brothers and sisters are believing that there's something called, so basically believing in LGBT ideology, believing in sexuality, right, as a thing, right, and then they say, I'm not gonna get involved in LGBT Pride Week month or whatever. I think that's far more damaging than them actually disbelieving in it, because it is something. It's a taghut as far as I'm concerned, right? The belief that these human beings are individuated across these rigid, permanent, deterministic categories that we just happen to have discovered 100 years ago, 150 years ago. If you believe in that and disengage from Pride Month, I think that's far worse, personally, because what are you doing? You're just kicking the can down the road, and eventually your iman is going to be in trouble because you haven't addressed the difference.
So in the workplace, how would you address that? So you have a conversation with your manager. And so how would you say, would you have, almost it's like a philosophical conversation, because I think most workplaces are jumping on the diversity bandwagon, not because necessarily they believe in it, they've invested so much of a conviction in it. It's because it's become emblematic of, we've got, this is what diversity is. Diversity is everybody should be who they want to be. And so somebody who identifies as gay should be able to live life unencumbered by any forced social pressure to conform to rigid views about what they consider to be sexuality. So if somebody wants to identify as gay, somebody wants to identify as lesbian, this is diversity, and we should all benefit if we agree to diversity. And it's very shallow. It's not very sophisticated, but people who adopt it think they are sophisticated. Like we're buying into this new paradigm.
The thing is, like I always say, we need a range of responses, all the way from the 1 second slogan, all the way up to the 30-hour series that you mentioned. But we need everything in between as well. We can't expect someone who's kind of deer caught in their headlights.
But from the point of view of the Muslim employee, all they want to do is see a result where they're not compromising their beliefs. So
they're not pushed in to do something they don't want.
Well, and that's it, right? So I don't think the individual person has to be really adept at all of these discourses. I think it's going to be really tough, especially at a corporate level, to convince them out of the human rights framework, because most companies are subservient to whatever is public. So I think at the end of the day, all you want to do is try to provide an avenue where people aren't coerced into doing something, so they can opt out without reprisal. Right, I can opt out, and it's not an issue for me. And for adults in general, it's easier to compartmentalize a lot of this stuff. It's not coming back. It's not hurting my career aspirations. It's not a big scandal that I'm not participating in. People understand that I'm Muslim, and because of that, I don't participate in it. If that gives me an opportunity to talk about this more and explain why I'm not doing it, great. In most contexts, it probably won't, because in most workplace contexts, what's going to happen is that they're going to say, there are HR policies related to a topic like this, and you don't have the grounds for engaging in sort of moral deliberations or moral debates. And some of those may even protect Muslims insofar as you can't really question people's beliefs at the workplace, right? You can't make a Muslim. And that's, at a minimum, we want to provide the means where Muslims don't feel like their religion has to get interrogated at work just because they're working somewhere. And so,
I think we need to,
sorry to interrupt. Interesting is that we were talking about it before, that in my last workplace, interesting thing, my last workplace for about 2.5 years, my manager identified as gay. Yeah. And
see how he said that? My manager identified as gay.
He openly
take note, people.
He openly he never hid it. Everybody knew how he identified it, and he he was very open about it. And I had a conversation with him about the things that I can and cannot do in regards to that. I basically said, okay, literally people can live how they want. We live in a diverse society. People can choose how to live their life. But I have certain moral perspectives on this issue, and I can't in any way compromise those. And he was like an old school, from an old school background. And he was like, I fully accept that position. Now, I would believe that a younger person, who's more gung-ho, who's not from that old school background, would be less tolerant than he was. And almost say, if you don't accept these fundamental principles about how I live my life, then you are intolerant.
Yeah, I think workplaces in general right now are much easier than what's happening in schools and other places. Because at work, you generally compartmentalize all the time. You're just talking about work, maybe you'll talk sports or the weather. There's just enough mileage you can get out of these generic conversations with colleagues where you're daily
Unless it's Pride Month.
Well, even Pride Month, typically it's not a daily work conversation. Typically it's not, hey, today's Pride Month, what do you guys think about homosexuality? That's usually not a workplace conversation. At most, you might get a work email saying that our company's, acknowledging Pride Month or celebrating Pride Month this month or something like that. There may be a workplace event that occurs to commemorate it or something like that. But usually those events are optional. Typically, up till now, very few companies really make them mandatory. Where people feel the pinch is at senior levels.
What about the question I get asked is, look, in my workplace, we are being asked to put pronouns in our email signatures. What do you, in that situation, would you push back against that, or just say, I'm going to conform to that, and I'll say he and him rather than whatever? How would you respond, do you think, at that situation?
If you're just getting asked, you don't necessarily have to do it, right? If someone's forcing you to do so, I can't imagine any company would force you to say you have to.
Actually, part of HR policy sometimes say we need people to express their pronouns, so that there's no, like, there could potentially be an HR problem if somebody is addressed by the wrong pronoun. So they'll say, if you can make sure that everybody has pronouns at the names, or it may not be a rule, but imagine if your manager does it, then there's an expectation that the team has to do it as well.
Social pressure.
So I think we have to distinguish between social pressure and HR policy. Social pressure, I think people just have to have a little bit of confidence, right? When it comes to an HR policy, I don't know that like putting your pronouns in parentheses is something worth losing your job over, right? Like I don't know that that's the fight that you want to take down.
Would you think it's a virtue here to to refuse to answer the question?
To pronouns? Yeah. In some ways.
Would you just say my pronouns are he, him because I'm a man?
I guess it depends on context, right? I guess it depends on context, but by default, I would just take that as an assumption, an assumed part of who I am. And I don't think people would even question that. I don't think people would question that for most people. The entire world is capitulating for a very small fraction of the population that is now taking, gender non-binary pronouns, or, taking pronouns that aren't consistent with their actual gender. And suddenly now, like, everyone else has to do the identification game. But I think that, again, this is one of those issues where if it actually becomes an HR policy, ideally, a person doesn't have to be in a position where he or she has to fight it, but we actually have organizations, we have advocacy work, we have things that's going on to say, hey, these corporations are forcing their employees. We have institutions that are actually taking them to court over it, and it's not the fight of the individual Muslim to try to work this out. It's something that they can work on, and on the ground level, a person is limiting their what they have to do, even in the context where they have to do it. Right, and so
let me ask you this: what are your program pronouns?
Me? Yeah. Well,
he refuses to answer.
No.
But interesting.
I refuse to identify my brother. No,
but interesting. I spoke to his brother yesterday. He works in an educational institution, and he said, actually, this whole pronoun thing has actually helped me. Because my name is Omar,
Yeah.
And people, when they used to email me out of the blue, they didn't know whether I was a man or a woman. Now, because I put he and him at the bottom of my email, they know I'm a man.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess
Just
some Muslim names can do that, right? Because some people don't, especially when they're unfamiliar with like Arabic names or certain names in different cultures and societies. You don't know just based on the name whether someone's male or female. I mean, even for me, I remember I was researching something yesterday, and I noticed that the name of the loneliness minister in the UK, her name is Baroness. And I didn't know offhand. I guess I should have known with the S part of it, but Baroness, I said, okay, is that like a male or female? I don't want to misgender this person is or misidentify them because it didn't scream to me one or the other. And so I Googled and it's female. And but that's not a common name in the United States at all.
Sorry?
Do you know who it is?
I've got no idea.
Yeah.
I
had to Google.
Member of the House of Lords still.
Yeah. But that's not a common name at all in the United States that you would run into.
The fact that we have a loneliness minister is a whole other kind of topic of discussion.
Oh, yeah.
She's
global. We're Europe's one of the leading countries in loneliness.
Nobody wanted it. It's a very lonely existence.
Yeah, and I would say when it comes to people who are gender non-conforming, who tell you my pronouns are they, them, or whatever, Z, stuff like that.
And one in schools, I was speaking to a parent the other day, and he said there's a teacher who was female but identifies as male, started to basically grow her hair short, wear male clothes, and she's no longer called Mister, she's called Mixter. That's all the people were told you got to call her Mixter Smith rather than Mr.
Sounds
Smith.
like an MC name.
Yeah, and so
or Mixed Up Smith. Sorry.
No, I mean in that position, what you try to do is you try to limit the extent to which you actually have to observe these things. So if it's like someone named I don't know, John now or something, and it's actually a she, and she now goes by John, and her pronouns now are they, them. Let's just let's take the crazy example, right? I'd say that a person, when they speak to this woman, can just keep saying, hey, John. Like when you're talking directly to someone, you don't use pronouns.
Yes.
Right?
The interesting thing is...
you called her a woman.
Huh?
But the interesting about the pronouns...
of course. I mean, I would in another context, but now if I have to observe that as a HR policy, right, I would say, okay, I'm trying to limit the extent to which I'm doing so. I'm not just getting comfortable with these,
I said to Yusuf once, you remember I said to Yusuf as a joke kind of years ago, and ever since then I've thought about it, it's actually quite a good idea. That why don't we encourage to say, fine, you can have all the pronouns you want, whatever, 100 genders, but just give Muslims 2. Let us have these 2, right? And these are the 2 that we're going to believe in. Why not?
Yeah, well, the significance of this is really the way that they're manipulating language, right? And that's not a trivial concession, because in some ways you could say it's kind of harmless, right? You're just sort of talking about people this way. The aggregate effect is what begins to happen, where now you've reconditioned the way language is being employed, and the assumptions that are baked into that language is now something that I have to invoke and instrumentalize as part of my own discussions with people. And you'd say, no, like that's actually significant. That's really significant. It's not innocent at all when looked at as sort of the bigger game that's going on. And so, in contexts where you don't have a choice, you don't have a choice. But even when you don't have a choice, it doesn't mean you just embrace it.
But the interesting thing is that, because in Urdu they have a formal way of speaking about people. And so I remember when my wife speaks about her father, she doesn't say he, because that's disrespectful. She says they. I spoke to somebody today who said, I spoke to my Ustadh and they will meet you tonight. And so we're already using pronouns to a certain extent. So
in Urdu, I mean, how would you say they for the father, I guess?
Because they have said that
we say in English as well. We have it in English as well, the royal we. So when out of respect, when I say so and so is in the third person, when I say in the second person, I don't say you is.
But like in order to use like up
say
and
you
things,
are.
You don't really have a clear like he or she. I mean, it's a gendered language, but you don't have a clear he or she. You would say like up, right? Which is sort of.
I think the issue is the gender thing, not the pronouns thing. The pronouns are just like a... But, I mean... What was I going to say?
But I think one thing I'm interested in is this fact that, there's... parents always speak about, how quickly the tide has changed. Like only about 5 years ago in this country, lot of these discussions that are happening now weren't happening then, around how quickly people have adopted this idea of pronouns, how quickly people have accepted or seem to publicly accept the fact that somebody can change gender, or the fact that somebody can love who they want to love. And so, and even though people may have niggling doubts about this privately in relation to the LGBT stuff, now the T area of the T, there's more public attacks or disagreements about that. But what do you think why do you think things have changed so quickly, almost seemingly overnight, around this? What is it that some people say the LGBT lobby has achieved something that nobody else has achieved because they've put a lot of money, a lot of hard work, a lot of effort into that? Now, how would you characterize? How would you characterize? Some people say it's because of the way the left-wing screenwriters in Hollywood have introduced all these LGBTQ characters into their films, into the programs, the way popular culture has accepted that. What would you say are the key factors in almost this overnight change of acceptance of LGBTQ identities? Well,
I don't think it's just one issue, right? I think there are a number of things that are coming together and converging to produce a social context. And, it's like a seed, right? A seed can germinate and grow and flourish and thrive if it has the right soil with the right pH and it receives the right level of irrigation and sunlight, like the weather and the temperature. All of these things have to be in a right balance to allow that tree to bear fruit and to grow. In some ways, what you've had with the LGBT movement is you have all of those conditions perfectly lined up for it to flourish and thrive socially, and for it to sort of win the culture and win the moment, because you have what some scholars have referred to as expressive individualism. You have cultural, social, political liberalism. You have secularism. You have digital technology and the role that it plays. You have politics. And you have a really sort of aggressive and angry political environment that has become heavily tribalized. And what that does is it tends to polarize every discussion, and activist groups never sort of claim victory and say, we've accomplished what we wanted, it's time for us to go home. Instead, what they do is they keep moving they keep moving the goalpost further and further and further until they can keep finding new causes. And there's a ton of things that are going on. I think all of them are coming together in a way right now which makes this issue somewhat unique in just how aggressive it feels all the time. But on the T front, I think the areas where people are expressing consternation and reservations actually shows how far along it is. Because people are saying, look, we have to draw a line in the sand somewhere, right? I mean, it's like sports, right?
That's a sacred aspect of life, isn't it?
Right, and we're seeing things that are so absurd in the domain of sports. Like, these men are just dominating women in sports. And
you mean trans women?
Yeah, trans women. Yeah, they're just dominating them in sports, and everyone knows that that's going to happen. And still, a sort of angry minority of voices are speaking up on that and saying what's plainly evident to everybody. And yet, in spite of that, it continues to get pushed and promoted.
I think the key for us, though, is not to jump into some of the US culture wars and pick a side, but to stay outside of it from a distance, saying, look at what philosophical, political, cultural foundations, even their religious foundations, really, what they actually led to.
Yeah, right? So I think you
and offer an alternative to the world.
I think it's, in some ways, you have to do multiple things at once. One is you have to thoughtfully enter a dialogical space that's very hostile and confrontational. And you have to try to navigate it in a way that isn't beholden to it, but instead is beholden to your own beliefs and faith. And where that puts you, like I said, it doesn't matter, right? In some ways, it doesn't matter where that puts you. If it puts you to the right, if it puts you to the left, it really doesn't matter. You're just trying to understand your own convictions relative to this conversation topic in this moment, and you're trying to educate and inform your community on it in a way that allows them to understand it in the context of what's going on. At the same time, you do have to have some work that is engaged in actual, like, sort of social and cultural work. Like, you have to do some work there, because that's tough. That's very messy work. It's much easier actually not to do that work at all. But if you're not engaged in the political or legal front, you're not going to be represented when these things are actually impacting you directly. And so, you know, one of the challenges that we have right now is that LGBT organizations are well funded. They have dozens and dozens of researchers. They have people that have, if they go to a school, let's say they go to a school in London, they go to school in Maryland, US, anywhere, they have research and studies about how LGBT education helps LGBT youth, how it helps non-LGBT youth. They have outcome studies. They have, they just have a huge stack of research that they can bring to the table. They have lesson plans. They have recommended books. They have material that is ready to go and turnkey for schools. Schools have to do nothing. They have sessions. They have so much that they've done already. And when Muslims oppose that, they have angry parents. That's what we have. We don't have studies. We don't have books. We don't have material. We have very little that we can present. In many places in the West, we don't even have scholarly voices that can go there and say, you know, Islam's against this.
Yes.
They have nothing they can point to. Right.
Talking about scholarly voices, I'd just like to, because you spoke about navigating differences, and I wanted to just ask you a bit about that, in terms of you're one of the signatories of that statement.
I am,
And so I wanted to ask about what was the context behind, if you know the context behind that statement being produced. Like, what was the reason why there was this, that the scholars felt there was a need to produce this?
So my own feeling is, if you ask, you know, 20 different signatories of navigating differences, you'll get 20 different answers. That's the impression that I get.
So what's the Mobeen answer?
Yeah. So all I can do is represent why I signed it. And because I'm one name, there's now over 300 names.
But your name is quite high on the list, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that it's that high, actually. I think it's lower.
Did it have the third line? And that's,
Did it have his pronouns on it?
Yes, it says they, them.
They, them.
And it's unaffiliated name. It's just the names there. And
but you're the only non-sheikh on there. I looked through the whole list.
Yes, that's true.
That's a bit offensive, bro.
No, he's right. That's right.
It's Ustadh.
No, I'm not.
So they put you on that list for a reason.
Yeah. And even Ustadh,
if I was to ask to be on that list, they would say, "There's the door." Yeah.
Well, I guess you're not in North America.
I've been called worse.
That's why. No, and even Ustadh is being generous, right? But so they gave me a review of the statement. I provided some feedback. Alhamdulillah, they took almost all the feedback I provided. There were a couple of areas that they didn't.
What were those different? No,
So
how did you navigate those differences?
Yeah. No, that's a discussion topic on its own. But I looked at this specific because I live in Maryland.
Yes.
Right. And we had ongoing issues that were taking place at the school board level, and it was expanding. So there were other counties that were considering this. And we already had issues at the school board level where we had Muslims showing up who were in favor of pro-LGBT teachings. We had Muslims that were against it. Muslims were at the epicenter of the debate. Really, they were at the center of the debate. And you have a large Muslim community there. And we have, in recent years in the United States, we've had a number of Supreme Court cases that have revolved around homosexuality or transgenderism. 303 Creative, the Christian Baker case, all these cases, they're not necessarily dealing with Muslims themselves, but the rulings impact the extent to which Muslims can live faithfully on an issue like this. And so the stakes have actually been ones that Muslims are going to be impacted by. And when you look at those cases, every single brief that a Muslim organization in America has submitted has been in support of the LGBT side and against religious freedom. And so the major sort of civil rights organizations in America, for the most part, until very recently, have been either relatively silent or in favor of, LGBT rights, even at the expense of the rights of Muslims who are trying to live faithfully in public life. And so that's big. And now you have counties, you have all these areas, and you don't have an authoritative document that you can point to so that Muslims can hopefully start producing briefs that use that to help represent the Muslim position, so that you can have Muslims that show up at the workplace or at school boards and say, this is what Islam has to say. And so the way I viewed it was as a contribution that can help in these very particular contexts. It's not a document that I'm going to give to a non-Muslim for the purpose of da'wah. It's not a pedagogical tool or an instrument that I'm going to introduce in an Islamic school to teach children, but it's a statement that I can take to a company that's trying to pressure me into attend Pride Month and say, look, it's not just me. Here's a link to a website. You have over 300 imams.
Yeah.
And it's an
and in that
authoritative
sense, it has to
statement.
be as streamlined as possible. You can't have everything in it. It has to be very specific and concise to the point.
Absolutely. And so it's not terribly long. I think substantively, there's nothing in it that I thought was terribly controversial. There were a couple of things perhaps here and there that people quibble with, but I think overall it sort of represents what Islam says in a principled way. And for me, I looked at the aggregate benefit that could have in these various domains of life, especially when I looked at what's happening in Canada, what's happening in my own local jurisdictions. And in some ways, I think the outcome of it has vindicated it because it has been used in many of those contexts. It has motivated many people to speak out when they wouldn't have before. So it's actually encouraged a lot of Muslims to do things that they wouldn't have done in its absence. In addition to that, it's actually motivated a number of imams who previously were concerned about this but didn't have a voice to talk about this, where now they can look at that and say, okay, now I'm going to start speaking and I'm going to use that as a sort of platform for me to catapult my own discussions about this in my community settings. And so this past June, we had more khutbahs on this topic than we've had in the past decade in America. And so, I didn't expect all of that to occur. I just thought at a minimum, it would be helpful for Muslims that are in these very particular predicaments. And yet it has actually been beneficial in other areas that I didn't fully anticipate.
Excellent. Very good. Alhamdulillah.
We had a similar one in the UK, isn't it? A few years ago.
Yes.
When there was
2019,
you might have seen the Birmingham school kind of protests and stuff. But the thing is, like Yusuf was saying, like how he spoke to his boss, his manager, right? That's the kind of thing we want to get across, that this is how you can have in terms of what's our vision, right, at the end of this, okay? Like, obviously not long-term vision about, everyone entering Jannah and everything, but a kind of a near vision of what does a positive outcome look like? What are we actually working towards? What do we want here, right? Do we want to just be angry parents, or do we want to come to a kind of a solution which is like a win-win for all parties?
Can we be both? No?
Well, it could be angry if you want.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned a phrase, I wrote it down actually.
What was that?
That you're able to opt out without reprisal. Right? That's a good.
Let me write that down.
Kind of, I guess.
Well, I think there's sort of the short-term aims and objectives. So even in Maryland, the situation's not great. What we're trying to do and what parents are trying to do there is say that their children in public schools should be entitled to opt out of teachings on subjects related to sexuality and gender. They just want to opt out. They're not even objecting to the teachings, right? Which shows just how far this is, right? Ideally, those teachings wouldn't even be introduced at such young levels or in the public school. So when it comes to just the general advocacy work, in some ways, there's the short-term issues that are going to come up situationally that you're just going to have to combat and try to argue against as best as you can. And understanding the situation and the limitations that exist. Alongside that, you do want a program that exists that it is at least making efforts to try to shift the culture and that's trying to offer a voice to society. Because Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, commanding the good and forbidding the evil, at a minimum, we're just trying to say, look, this is Allah's guidance, right? This is Allah's guidance. And at a minimum, ma'adhiratan ila rabbikum, perhaps we'll be forgiven in front of Allah. Perhaps we'll be forgiven in front of Allah because we see what happens to the complexion of a society that mainlines transgression at such aggressive levels and that normalizes and celebrates it. And that's not a healthy outcome because what that does is, transgression, fahisha, it's contagious, right? Like there's a reason, many ways, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden these things. It's not without wisdom. And we have to recognize, and we're seeing that. We're seeing it every single day. You keep asking yourself, why do these things worsen, right? Why don't they stop? And it's almost the nature of sin, especially certain types of sin, that they get worse and worse and worse until and unless you try to draw people back and get them to understand what an ethical and moral life looks like. And that's why when you talk about even teaching our children or teaching our youth, it's not about taking homosexuality and transgenderism for special treatment and saying, here's how we can address this and talk about this as Muslims. It's about giving them a view of Islam's socio-familial ethics as a whole, where they understand the Muslim family, where they understand the importance of nasab and, inheritance and, maintaining the ties of kinship and being good to your parents and the status of mothers in Islam and all the rest. There's so much, and even how we interact as men and women with khalwa and iffa and haya, modesty. You have all of these things, and it's a very rich tradition. And I think the picture, the portrait that gets painted when people learn this is very beautiful. It really is. It's profound, and you look at it and you say, subhanAllah, like this is a tremendous contribution that Islam is bringing to the table, especially in light of our societies and what's going on here. You compare it to what people see outside, you say, this is a different world. And when we can not only teach that, but we have communities that are embodying it, where they are seeing the lived reality of what Islam actually says, I think that becomes a really powerful counter to what society is trying to push onto us.
And we need the whole suite of means to get that to people, right? The media, the stories, the narrative production, the film, the books, because that's how you present and project a cultural kind of, because a lot of the things you said, or the virtues about Islam, unfortunately the pro LGBT Muslims, they'll use a lot of the same narratives and language. Not to say that they're anywhere near as numerous and significant. You were talking about the other day that they actually we kind of give more credit than is due in terms of inflating the number of pro-LGBT Muslim kind of organization. We don't want to kind of scare the community that this is a big thing, but we have to understand that their perspective so that we can address the actual issue, right? Because their perspective is not we're normalizing fahisha. Their perspective is they have a mistaken belief, right? And they're building something on top of that mistaken belief. Okay? From the Muslim perspective, at least.
Their perspective is that they are embarking on a moral project.
Yeah.
They believe that they're doing something that is good and fundamental to humanity. Right? They look at themselves as sort of freedom fighters at times.
That's almost as if they're the one that people who abolish slavery, they're the equivalent in today's society. We are destroying this huge oppression. It's a civil rights battle.
The motif is always magnanimous. Where they situate themselves historically.
But we have to actually address that mistake, that mistaken belief, because it's an issue of the underlying philosophy of personhood and humanness. Like one thing we suggest is going a bit on the front foot, right, and saying we don't just want opting out is good. Obviously, we want to opt out, but how do we articulate that? Do we say, I want to invoke my right as a Muslim to opt out of these things? Fair enough. But if we're asked, we should be clear that the reason I'm opting out is because you're the one who's trying to proselytize something upon others. You're trying to impose your beliefs, which you completely and accidentally, historically speaking, inherited because you were born in this time and place to those parents, right? You're imposing your beliefs on our children, for example, and that's what we're opting out of. Not that we agree that you're embarking on some completely neutral kind of teaching of just facts as they are out there in reality in an unbiased way, and we want to opt out of that because of our religious quirks or whatever. No, we are invoking that you be tolerant. So I think we need to shift the lens there to actually accuse those who are trying to enforce and proselytize and indoctrinate other people we need to try and force that onto the agenda. That look, this is why I'm opting out, and I think it's very important to get the global picture as well, because I mean we were talking about a few days ago, Malaysia. It was in the news. Malaysia. So the company Swatch, right?
Okay.
They had some LGBT coloured, rainbow coloured watches that they were kind of selling, and the Malaysian government ordered for them to be kind of taken off the shelves. It was a massive thing. Homophobia, obviously, you know.
Yeah.
And then a rock band called 1975. They, you know, when they saw this, what Malaysia did, out of protest, they cancelled all their kind of tour. In Indonesia.
Alhamdulillah.
But actually, when I read the article, it wasn't that. It was that it wasn't that they were actually Indonesia, because they attacked a lot of these countries for their regressive policy. So Indonesia banned them, and because of that, then they couldn't go to Malaysia. So it wasn't that they decided not to do that, but I think the band. Yes.
They cancelled the
but I
rest
think
of their tour
that was
dates.
because they were banned from
protest.
Indonesia. But it wasn't their decision. It wasn't their decision. But anyway,
we just saw that upstairs.
Okay.
Even if it was their decision, I mean, that's great.
Yeah.
But
But the point is,
my point was, who was 1975? I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
never heard
Like,
of them.
who cares? Yeah.
I just heard them in the news.
It's not
But
as
the
if
point
there was
is-
some great thing that we lost now because of this. No.
But I think that the point is the narrative, right? We don't want our young brothers and sisters not recognizing what's really at play here, and that is
Don't buy Swatch watches.
and that this is this episode is sponsored by Apple Watch. Just kidding. What we want to get across is this is a global. I think Joseph Massad calls it like the gay international, right?
Yeah.
This is a global attempt to enforce and otherize, enforce a metric upon which Muslims are otherized, right? He has 3 chapters in his very important book, Islam and Liberalism, right?
Yeah.
So you know, essentially, the it goes back right to the beginning of the conception of Europeanness, right? To define what is European and the Euro-American, therefore, right? In contradistinction to the other, right? The Muslim, the infidel, the Mohammedan, whatever, the Moors, and in doing so, you kind of project all your own insecurities onto them. Chapter 1, I think, was the democracy despotism binary. Chapter 2 is women's rights, and chapter 3 is the gay international, right? So this is a global kind of agenda, not necessarily to spread fahisha. That's probably, some people have that intention anyway, but on a policy level and on a kind of discursive level, it's to reproduce the othering of Muslims as and the twin kind of colonial impulses of to dominate and to civilize.
Well, there's the dominate, civilize, but there is the extent to which they want global Muslims to conform. They want to be able to set the moral terms for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Because there is sort of the Western hubris. The Western hubris is always there.
That's right.
And one of the reasons why this is such an important issue for us to speak out on is because we live in countries that have global influence. And they exercise that global influence repeatedly. If you look at a country like the UK, you have had sheikhs and imams that have been prevented from entering the country because of statements that they've made on homosexuality. Now that sends a message to a lot of du'at who say, well, I'm not sure that I want to talk about this if it's going to lead me to being banned from entering UK, France, Germany, like Denmark.
I was speaking to a prominent sheikh. I won't say which country we're in, but he said I was approached by I think members of the European Parliament or prominent members in the EU representing the EU countries, saying we will pay for first class tour, giving you giving lectures all over the Muslim world, right? And all you have to say is, if a woman wears hijab and she identifies as lesbian, that's fine.
SubhanAllah.
This is an international sheikh, right? He's got millions of followers and all that kind of stuff. And that's precisely what's happening. But some people are ideologically driven for that. They believe that and want to spread that.
If you look at grants,
but in terms of the structures, the structures don't necessarily have to believe in that stuff, but what they're trying to do is use that as a stick to beat Muslims with, because of foreign policy goals, because of
I think both of those things are going on, right? I think people do look at Muslim societies when they liberalize as a success story. They look at that with success and glee, because they've now produce societies that actually reflect their own cultural norms and values. They want to see that.
Western
people can't help but do da'wah. They can't help but do that. They are not at home with the idea that these other countries are different. And so when we speak out against these things, it's not just about the limited impact that we're going to have on our schools and our children. It's also about the way in which our countries are using this issue as a bludgeon against so much of the Muslim world and are making it untenable for these countries to
politically. We saw the World Cup in Qatar, but recently there was another example where we were reading before the session about this World Service BBC journalist who went into Morocco and started in a press conference in front of the world's media, started to interrogate the captain of the Moroccan women's, I think, football team, and ask her questions about what do you think about the Moroccan law which prohibits same-sex relationships and where somebody is imprisoned or fined heavily for that. Do you think that's acceptable? And even other journalists were saying this questioning was completely out of order. First of all, this is a footballer. Now, you wouldn't go to a footballer in another country and ask them about the political situation in their country and say, what do you think about the Conservative government's austerity package and the fact that they're reducing benefits for the poorest in our society? What do you think about that? They wouldn't think about doing that. But it's almost this colonialist mentality that we have to impose our default values upon the world, and these are the only values you can really accept
to dominate and civilize.
And so you've got to almost either say, I don't agree with that, or you come out as a bigot and say that you accept that. And accept that binary. That's the only time they talk about binary, is when they have these two propositions.
And Muslims have to be prepared to get criticized and attacked. Look, what's happened in the United States and Canada with Muslim parents pushing back. In recent weeks, we've had Jen Psaki, who's now with MSNBC. She used to be the White House communications director and correspondent. She came out she did a whole segment about Muslims and how they're being manipulated by the right. Mehdi Hassan, right, has done an entire segment on MSNBC on this topic. Wajahat Ali was printed in the New York Times, accusing the Muslims of becoming right-wingers on this and saying that they need to stop. So you have all of these voices that are coming out of the blue and coming together to develop a story and narrative to scare Muslims out of this and to malign Muslims who are actually engaged in advocacy work to protect their own children. Right? That's what they're doing.
That they almost see that Muslims are so weak that they can be used by any political forces around them to fulfill their plans.
Unfortunately, it's true though.
I don't agree with that.
Well, not only that, there's an extent to which that they look at Muslims as almost mindless, right? But it's also the way in which they are so allied and tethered to their own political doctrine. Like they can't help but see things through their own lens because they are almost dispositionally liberal. They think everyone else has to be conservative and liberal just like them. And, you're
using your own framework to define others against your own.
I feel like telling these people sometimes, we're not you. We're not obsessed with right and left wing politics the way you are. Right? That's your world. You live it. The rest of us don't.
I don't know about the US situation, but I still feel that we as a community have some small part of blame on our shoulders for that, because we do actually reproduce left-wing and right-wing kind of.
But to a certain extent, the accusation in the UK is that Muslims are too tethered to the left rather than to the right. Because we've had this unhealthy
for some
affiliation to the Labour Party. Whatever the Labour Party does, we seem to want to support them, whether they support our interests or not. But there's never been really that almost mindless support for the right in that same way.
And we haven't had any mindless support for the right. It's only been a couple of protests, and now people are accusing those individuals of being manipulated by the right.
I think if we make our language a bit more airtight, and our messaging very simple, very clear, very distinct from right-wing kind of messaging as well. I think we can fortify ourselves against those.
How do you think our messaging has been almost right-wing? I don't really think that's...
One of the things is, for example, I noticed, right? For example, not to attack you or anything.
No, please.
You use the word homosexuality.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I would suggest is, for example, is like we trained Yusuf up here. Instead of saying homosexuality or transgender, I think transgenderism is semi-okay to use as a term. But if you say homosexuality, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
He knows what you mean. But the left-wing ear hears that as you are against a political category, an identity, a personhood.
Well, the way I'm using it is as a conceptual ideological phenomenon. So I don't.
I know in a kind of academic setting, that's perfectly fine. But in the public sphere, I mean, we did this media training thing once a few years ago, and they said your messaging, your media messaging has to be understood by the farmer in Texas. I don't know if there's something against Texan farmers.
No. I don't know either.
But basically a thick person, a dumb person has to understand your messaging. And when we say words like trans, gay, even straight, right, without qualifying them, like we're saying, for example, someone identifies as whatever, if we just say it as it is like that, we kind of give the impression that we believe in the philosophical, the ontological foundations of these.
I think it depends on how. I think it depends on the context, because there's going to be times where you may use language, but you're not compromising your entire ontology. But nevertheless, I think that when it comes to media narratives, you're always going to be limited, because even on issues like this, the left is not going to portray you in a sympathetic light, so you're not going to get your message out on liberal media platforms. You could potentially use right-wing media platforms that may be more amenable to what you're saying, but then you're going to get disparaged immediately. You're going to get disparaged by all those people on the left and potentially people on the right who are uncomfortable with you being on there. So you have I think we have to recognize that there are some limitations given the current media climate with what you're going to be able to do.
But I mean, I saw this. I think it was Maryland. I saw a sister in hijab giving like a speech at like a school board or something.
That was a school board hearing.
I found that as a really good, positive kind of. But because I think, as far as I remember, she didn't use these terms as though.
No, mashallah, that was
very good.
Sister Samira Munshi.
I think I think that's the one.
Great job, mashallah.
Yeah, so that was a really good, mashallah, example. And that's what we tried to do as well in that Birmingham statement. Because the point is, look, if your back's against the wall and or a kid is being questioned or interrogated or whatever, or at work or something, you need something short and snappy. And if we say we don't agree with homosexuality or whatever, that's not going to cut it. That's too open to being attacked by lefties as some right-wing kind of.
Well, I think mashallah, I think Sister Samira did a great job, and I think a number of other parents there have as well. The thing is, even her video, it went somewhat viral. I think it got a couple of 100,000 views. But that's just an independent YouTube video that got, that went somewhat viral. It's not the Washington Post, New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, which is producing the alternative, right? Such that if a person on the outside is actually reviewing this issue, they're not going to form their political judgments on the basis of a viral YouTube video unless they came across it, in which case they may be a little bit more conscientiously informed about what's going on. Most of the time, their positions are going to be informed by mainstream media outlets. And I only say this because if you look at the Sunnah of the Anbiya, I don't think any of us would say that they had a bad discourse. Every single one of them were maligned and attacked. Every single one of them. They were called dumb and stupid. They were called, sorcerers. They were called crazy. Like that is, it's almost the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if you're standing up for truth, people are going to attack you. And there may be times where you can mitigate that, right? Where it's obviously our duty to exercise wisdom. And wisdom is going to entail different things. Sometimes in certain circumstances, wisdom is going to be muscular. And other times it may be tempering down that muscular narrative. But I do think that anybody that speaks out on this should be prepared for getting heavily attacked in ways that they may not have previously.
So what do you think about, from a thought leadership perspective, one of the kind of guidelines we give to the Muslim community when talking about this is, say for example, don't use words like homosexual, heterosexual, homosexuality, heterosexuality, but use instead terms from our own tradition, right, or our own framework. And if you want to, somebody does identify as gay, you don't say that's a gay man. You say that's a man who identifies as gay. Do you get what I mean? The subtle difference.
Yeah.
Or and so some people might say, well, that's the word. We have to use the words, their words, and what else should we use?
We might teach them what people are conveying when they're saying that they're gay. That there's so much going on at once. We want to understand what it is.
I think that's really good for the longer, more in-depth stuff. But I think for a very short kind of medium messaging or a quick slogan or something, or just general rules for everyday speech, I think that's an easy thing for us to kind of, I guess, institute.
Even you'll say, well, we're against homosexual behaviors. Right?
I think I would say we should avoid that.
I don't know. I think that's pretty homosexual behaviors, you're qualifying it.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I know what Muslims mean when they say that. But again, when the young person hears homosexual, they're thinking of a category of human being.
Yeah, well, I think the young person's probably not going to get conceptual nuance anyways, especially really young. It depends how young they are.
Not really young.
But I think many young...
When I spoke about this to that group of teenagers I mentioned, I think we underestimate their intelligence, because when I actually started explaining, I said, look, the question is wrong. Yeah. Gayness, lesbian, it's not an issue of being. So what's wrong with being gay or lesbian? I say there's an assumption in the question. Who knows what, what a social construct is, for example, like money. Yeah. Is there a difference between a £5 note and a £10 note? No, this is something that human beings kind of culture is like, let's get together, let's call this that. Yeah. So likewise, if we say, for example, and this is what I like about the scientific and medical community in particular, right? Yeah. They don't use, you might know, I don't know in the USA, but in the UK scenario, it's very strict. They don't use terms like homosexual, heterosexual. They use terms like MSM.
Yeah, MSM. Yeah, that's quite common.
They use terms like arousal template.
Yeah.
Right. From like neuroscientists and stuff. And what are these things? So these are matters of fact, right? Yeah. This person, part of his or her arousal template is X, Y, Z, whatever.
Well, I think
other men or feet or
sure.
or whatever.
Well, when people identify as gay, they're not just signaling behaviors or even an identity. They're also signaling a cultural situatedness. So they're talking about a lifestyle that they've taken on. Oftentimes they're signaling the company that they keep, the way they live, the way they think about politics or cultural issues. There's so many things that are entailments of that label. And there are many of them that actually are a problem, in addition to the actions, of course. Right? There are many of them that are.
But I think the real crux of it is that they believe, and that's the difference between gay and someone identifies as gay or queer, right? But gay, the one who identifies as gay, they believe that there's some magical quality inside them called sexuality, and that everyone has one. And this is very specific
like the orientation.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that it's just the essential part of their being, and they just want to.
Exactly.
But, part of it as well, and perhaps even, there's that. But there's also the question of identity formation and the understanding of the self, right? I think I mentioned expressive individualism. Robert Bellah coined that term. Carl Truman's been writing about this recently. He has a book called Strange New World, where he talks about the sort of way of the modern self. He also has Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. But there's a lineage to these ideas. And to some extent, these are ideas that have been established as part of the fulcrum of modern Western societies, modern European societies, modern societies as a whole, frankly, is this notion of self-definition, self-creation, authenticity, the desire to live for oneself. I mean, all of these things come together to produce a context in which not only the sexual identity and the gender identity, but any number of identities become so critical and crucial to a person's place in the world, the way he or she views himself, that that sometimes you have to unravel a lot, right? So.
And I fully think that we need to situate our resistance to that. Yeah. We should say, and there may be some time where I can't explain all of that. I only got 5 minutes, or I'm a 15-year-old child and my teacher's shouting at me. We need to find a way for our community to express that in a very simple way, without them rubber stamping those philosophical, ontological, religious even, and mystical kind of foundations
Yes.
about human personhood and some kind of, the epistemology of the closet. I read one book ages ago about, so. And I think one way is to say, look, to bring it back to when you don't have time to explain all that, lakum dinukum waliya din.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you actually, and this is, I think 90% of the battle is getting the non-Muslim or even the Muslim who's absorbed this non-Muslim discourse, getting them to recognize that what you're trying to impose on me is not some facts about the universe, it's your own cultural view and beliefs, which I don't share with you.
Of course.
To you is your way and to me is mine. You see, if you do that, then the ball's in their court to be tolerant. And if they refuse, then let it be clear that, look, we're the ones calling for proper tolerance of ideas, right? That let people have different worldviews, let people discuss and try and, convince each other of those worldviews, give dawah, debate and so forth. But don't impose your worldview on us. Right?
Yeah, well,
and I think young people or people who are being lectured by their teachers, so we've seen those viral videos and stuff. I think they're in a place where they can articulate that. But it would be a disaster if they, instead of doing that, if they just replicated right-wing language and arguments against LGBT.
Again, I think you don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good, right? Even things that I'd say, all we have is angry parents. Well, angry parents have actually been surprisingly effective. Really. I mean, they have gotten a lot of mileage out of just expressing their anger and frustration in imperfect ways. But nevertheless, they're doing so, and that's actually bearing fruit in important spaces. So I would say, look, let's not downplay the fact that there may be imperfect ways to discuss this, but nevertheless, if people are doing things motivated by their conviction for their deen, Allah knows, right, that there can be positive outcomes that come there that aren't going to be checking off every box when it comes to like discourse specificity, but nevertheless may be enough for them and may even help them more in other places. I also think we also have to recognize that as we engage this topic, there may be certain inherent limitations. So one of the things we're coming to appreciate in North America is the way many administrators and faculty in schools look at Muslims. Because when you hear them speak in unfiltered ways about Muslims, you realize just how low their opinion is of the Muslim community. And that gets you to appreciate and understand that you need to start investing more in alternatives. Because these people have such a low opinion of you. Why would I send my kids there for 7 hours a day, 10 months out of a year, 5 days a week to hang around with these people? How can I do that as a responsible parent, as a caring Muslim parent, right? Instead, I'm going to do more for homeschooling. I'm going to try to invest more in Islamic school. I'm going to put a lot more into the alternatives that I have in the past because I'm recognizing how toxic these settings are and how they're comprised of people who occasionally have very, very negative opinions about Islam. Right?
Sometimes I say to parents, sometimes I say to parents, unfortunately, we've got an unhealthy trust in schools. Sometimes we send our children to schools and think, okay, they got the best interests of our children at heart. Not all the time. I remember I spoke to a parent last week, and she said that my son went to school and delivered very positive news to the teacher and said, look, my mother's pregnant, my mother's going to have a baby, and this is primary school children, this is like a 8-year-old child, my mother's going to have a baby, I'm going to have a baby brother. He was really pleased with that news. And so he told the teacher, and he expected the teacher to say, oh, really excellent, well, congratulations, really good. The teacher said, how do you know that that's going to be a boy? When he grows up, he can decide whether he's a boy or a girl. And it's like he burst the bubble of that child on 2 levels. First of all, that's not how you respond to a child who gives you good news. But secondly, that idea of what you're saying is true, that there's no such thing as a male or female. How is that factually correct, biologically sound? As a teacher, you're delivering that to a pupil, your student. How is there's so many things that raced through my mind when I heard that. I just thought that's ridiculous.
Well, you guys, I think the good thing about the UK is you guys do have some advantages. One of your advantages is that Muslims tend to live very close to each other in large numbers.
In our ghettos,
but
it's good ghettos. We like those.
Well, you can represent your position in a much more authoritative way than when you're geographically dispersed. You're a much smaller minority in the school counties and districts. You may have schools here that are over 50% Muslim in terms of student population. For schools like that, you can have a very immediate impact because you represent.
But the only problem is, here where we are, we're surrounded by lots of schools which have 95% Muslim children. The head teacher, deputy head, like all what they call the senior leadership team, the people who actually make decisions in the school, they're all white.
By design.
All white. By design. I've spoken to people who have been in this borough who've actually progressed really well in terms of in their academic career, but there's been a glass ceiling imposed upon them. You're not getting any further than that. And I've heard of conversations between those head teachers in this area where they've said, we need to ensure that those type of people don't get into our position, because effectively we're part of a crusade to ensure that we liberate these children for the future, because our future depends upon those children, and almost freeing them from their parents who are just backward, regressive, barbaric. These people, it's almost colonialism at a school level.
British racism is far more sophisticated.
Absolutely.
And, you have to appreciate it sometimes. American racism, KKK,
very brazen.
But it's a bit like the French, you guys, right? But the Brits, mashallah, our racism is...
they smile at your face and they'll talk behind your back. They'll plot behind your back, and then you feel, the teacher's so nice.
Well, obviously that's. I mean, you guys know your context better than I do.
You know your context better, you did, and I have an impulse to disagree with you, right, on something you said, but I'll defer to you knowing your own context, because if over here to say Muslims, you can invest in your Islamic schools and homeschooling and stuff. It's a bit hypocritical of me to say that because my kids are homeschooled.
Same here.
Same here. Same here.
But I still think we shouldn't just leave.
Absolutely, no.
Leave the state schools.
My children have never been to state schools in their entire lives.
But I think we need to take the good fight to the state schools.
I
don't know how it is in the US. It might be impossible.
So there are different reasons why I'm. Obviously this is a big reason, huge reason why I'm critical of public schooling in the United States. But there are other reasons too. I mean, even on purely academic merit, it's not like public schools are great.
Here public schools actually mean fee-paying schools in the UK context. If you say public schools here, they're talking about Eton.
Okay.
They're like the creme de la creme of fee-paying schools.
No, fee-paying schools. These are just the state schools.
You're talking about the state schools.
In the States, Eton is what happens to a Krispy Kreme.
That's a mess.
No, so state schools for us, it's not as if they're offering just a stellar and pristine form of education to begin with. They have a lot of internal problems, and it's not as if Islamic schools don't have those problems, but it's to say that the alternatives aren't that much worse. And oftentimes you can exceed them, and you can excel beyond them without that much effort.
Sometimes I hear conversations like on Facebook and on like regionally based groups, and so people are saying, look, I'm moving to this area. And I'm looking for good schools, and I just observe the conversation between parents just as a third party, just to see what sort of conversation, and there'll be hundreds of messages. This school is good, this school is good. And actually the criteria for those parents around the schools is all to do with the perceived academic excellence of the school. And nobody actually says, that school is actually pretty bad in terms of it doesn't allow children to pray. That school is really strong indoctrination.
Another one of your ideas.
And but the thing is, the parents don't don't even factor in anything above academic excellence sometimes for schools, and so that is like your only thought about your children is like dunyawi concerns. There's nothing beyond that for in terms of when you're looking at what schools are best for your children, and that really frustrates me.
And I think many parents are extremely ambitious with their children. They tend to. When it comes to making academic decisions, they make decisions with the idea that my kid is going to be this brilliant doctor or Nobel Prize winner or something like that. Perhaps that'll be the outcome, who knows. But The idea that that is the likely outcome. Yeah, it's not the likely outcome. Most people end up getting somewhere between an average to, somewhere around an average education. And they end up going to a decent university. If they go to university, they get a degree in something and they start working. That outcome is not materially changed between different school settings. What does change are all of the other things that you're talking about. And when you think about that, you say, okay, like, how much am I investing in this sort of far off hope that my kid is going to be this really world-changing intellectual, as opposed to perhaps making some modest sacrifices, which may not even be sacrifices, reality, to ensure that their faith and their religion is stable for the long term.
So, one thing I noticed, like reading your work and listening to some of your stuff as well, same thing with Yusuf as well. So, I guess full circle.
I don't require a thesaurus when I speak. That's the only difference. No. See, I'm the dumbed down version of Mobeen. I'll speak in the language of the people. But he'll quote 1,000 books and I'll say, what book?
You just need one book, brother.
The Quran. I'm joking.
You're joking? Astaghfirullah.
No, astaghfirullah. I am not joking. Astaghfirullah. What are you trying to... You put words in my mouth. Anyway,
one thing you have in common is you actually both have a lot to, mashallah, tabarakallah, a lot of topics, of interest that you can talk about and have some insights on. But you're often kind of pigeonholed into the LGBT or kind of sex education, that kind of stuff. So let's agree to meet next time you're in town and talk about other things. I think
I can't talk about anything else.
Yeah. So. We'll try and make it a therapy session.
No, there's nothing else to talk about, is there?
Well, it's interesting because, I used to write more often. I still do on occasion about liberalism and secularism, but in some ways those topics have to become tangible. It's when you keep things at the conceptual level, at times people don't understand how that concept translates into the real world, right? It's just like people who have critiques of the nation state. You can have a really strong critique of the nation state, but until you can translate the impact and the negative impact of the nation state in a way that people can feel and observe, right? And so you may talk about specific issues like jingoism or nationalism, and that becomes the type of issue. And people may look at that and say, well, what's so wrong about having a strong national affiliation or patriot? But you have to have an issue that can highlight the problems of the bigger discourses, and then you can back into a bigger discourse, retroactively. In some ways, I think this particular topic of LGBT offers us an avenue to help illustrate greater problems between where do the tensions lie at the heart of secularism, where do they lie at the heart of liberalism. Like you're sort of backing into those issues oftentimes, but you're doing so in a way that is very tangible for people because they see discrete issues now and they understand why those issues have become issues.
Yeah, excellent. Jazakallah khair. Really enjoyed the convo, but unfortunately we're running out of time. Ustadh Mobeen, next time you're around, you've promised on camera now to join us again. And next time, inshallah, you'll be upgraded to Sheikh Mobeen. Maybe you'll have some more grey hairs.
I'll be higher up on a signature list or something like that.
They'll bump you up to number 1 or number 2 on the
second line or whatever.
Yeah, inshallah. Just below Yusuf, Sheikh Yusuf.
We will send a stern email, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Ustadh Mobeen, and obviously Yusuf Patel, thanks for coming. And Jazakallah khairan to you at home for watching. If you like this podcast, as usual, give it a like and a share. Let us know in the comments where you stand. If you agree, disagree, if you just want to make fun of anyone, then let us know. If you dislike this podcast, press the thumbs down button twice. That really helps. Anyway, from Islam Trinity and myself, I've been your host, Salman Butt. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.